The Recalcitrant Pastor, written and read by Christopher Halton. Group Captain Alfred Minns had not imagined that the final phase of the war would find him behind barbed wire, a reluctant guest of the Luftwaffe. Yet after his Lancaster had been pounced upon and struck down during a night raid in late 44, he and several of his crew had parachuted into the dark fields of Württemberg and fallen promptly into German hands. Fluent in the language from his pre-war years in Munich, where he had worked as a sales engineer representing a British industrial giant, Minns could understand not only his captor's words, but also the temper behind them. Following a brief and rather perfunctory questioning in Frankfurt, Minns found himself consigned to Stalag Luft 18. It was a new camp, thrown up in some haste, bleak upon a rise and scoured by a wind that seemed to bite through wool and leather alike. 4 compounds lay within the wire, set out with military neatness to the cardinal points, yet they held scarcely a fraction of the men for whom they had been built. The commandant, Oberst Heining, was of the older German school, formal, punctilious, and determined that the usages of war should be observed, however strained the times. Under his hand, a kind of routine established itself, meagre, often uncomfortable, but bearable, and far removed from the tales that filtered through of darker places elsewhere. Thus, within the wire, a fragile but tolerable existence persisted, despite shortages of food and fuel and the late stages of a losing war. All of this was undone when, without warning, prisoners began disappearing. Within a single month, 10 men, British, French, and American, vanished as though the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed them. The guard search teams, known to the prisoners as ferrets, could find neither tunnel nor tampered wire. Vehicles were thoroughly searched and accommodation huts were stripped plank by plank, but nothing availed. The disappearances continued, and with them the whispering rumours. Some accused other nationalities, others feared a murderous German psychopath lurking among the huts. But there was no proof, no tracks, no bodies, only an oppressive sense that order was slipping away. Heining, as perturbed as the prisoners themselves, summoned the senior Allied officers for an impromptu meeting. Minns suspected the subject was these baffling events, and so he attended alongside Colonel René de la Garde of the Free French Air Force and Colonel Rhys Cummings of the United States Army Air Force. But upon entering the commandant's office, the camp's lone brick structure, a former farmhouse, they encountered an unexpected presence, an SS Standartenführer named Otto Schultzer. Schultzer was a lean man with pale wintry eyes, razor-cut blonde hair, and a manner as sharp as a knife blade. He paced slowly behind Heining's desk and appeared to be gathering his thoughts. When he finally addressed them, his tone slapped the air. "The matter of these escapes has reached Berlin. I have been dispatched to resolve this, and by order of Reichsführer Himmler, I now hold command here." He then turned to a rather dismayed Heining and said, "I am relieving you of command. You are ordered to return to Berlin." He faced the assembled officers and added scathingly, "Should another man disappear, I shall order 5 of you shot, and it will be recorded as attempted escapes." Heining could endure no more. He sprang to his feet, his face red with anger. "You have no authority to contravene the Geneva Convention." Schultzer, who towered over him, stormed forward to stand nose to nose, a grimacing smile twisting his features. "You are no longer in command. It is clear you and others must have had involvement for this to happen." He barked an order in German, and 2 SS soldiers entered, seizing the now terrified Heining and removing him bodily. He was bundled into a black SS limousine and driven away along a crunchy, icy road through the camp gates before disappearing into the shimmering whiteness of a cold but sunny day. Feeling pleased, Schultzer seated himself at the desk and arranged his gloves and hat with an almost delicate precision. Looking directly at the Allied officers, he said rather coolly, "You're under SS protection. Comply with our instructions, and you will not be harmed. Disobey, and you will be shot like the dogs you are." Colonel de la Garde, much smaller in stature and older than the others, retorted, And you wonder why we French call you Le Boche. I must endure your threats, but one day, whether before man or God, you will answer for your actions. Oberst Heining is a far better man than you will ever be." Schultzer lost his temper entirely, screaming at the colonel in poor French. At one point, he pulled his Mauser pistol from its holster and waved it aggressively in the air, while the Allied officers stood in horrified silence, shocked that this man was now their camp commander. "Well," Schultzer snapped, "why are you still here?" All three men turned and left without a word, aware that Schultzer would not hesitate to shoot or punish them under any pretext. Outside, the prisoners watched as the Luftwaffe guards departed in a convoy of trucks that had previously brought the SS troops. Stern-faced guards took positions along the barbed wire and climbed into the 4 watchtowers equipped with machine guns. Others patrolled among the barracks, accompanied by vicious dogs that snapped and snarled. On the parade ground, Minns gathered the Allied leaders. "We have authorized no escapes," he said. "Our arrangements have been consistent for months, so something is occurring beyond our knowledge." De la Garde stamped frost from his boots. "Yet 7 of the missing are your countrymen, mon ami. The Americans have lost 2 and 1 Frenchman is gone. And yet we are only 50 out of your thousands. The balance is peculiar." Cummings, an enormous man in an A2 leather flying jacket and garrison cap, shook his head gravely and pulled up his collar against the biting breeze. "Before the war, I was a homicide detective. This looks planned but unpredictable. If a Luftwaffe guard was at fault, the disappearances may now cease." "Unless the men truly escaped," Minns countered wistfully. "There are no corpses, no blood, no disturbance at all. If only there were more clues." "Then we investigate as detectives," Cummings said. "I want a record of each missing man. Last sighting, hour, companions. Deliver it to me by 2 o'clock tomorrow during free association. Understood?" For several days the camp sank into a bleak quiet. The SS guards prowled like dogs on short chains, watching each prisoner closely with suspicion. During roll calls, searches were frequent, and prisoners were openly threatened. Yet Cummings, despite these difficulties, studied the lists in detail. Eventually he gave up, frowning. Nothing linked the cases save their utter inexplicability. Yet among the chaos and hostility, one man moved almost unseen throughout the camp. Pastor Wilhelm Dax, an elderly Lutheran cleric permitted to administer Christian rites to the prisoners and attend to their spiritual well-being, despite being a German from a neighbouring village. A slight figure, his narrow frame bent with the burden of years, he came and went with a freedom that no one thought to question. The guards nodded him through the gates almost absently, as though he were part of some long-established routine, and the dogs, fierce toward every prisoner, merely drew back and watched him pass. He moved slowly, leaning on a stick, his thin shoulders bowed, his lips working soundlessly. More than one man remarked later that they never heard his step on the wooden floors, nor could they recall the sound of his pony's hooves upon the frozen road. Looking back, Minns could not remember ever seeing the pastor arrive. He was simply there. At the time, such things escaped notice. He would appear in the draughty wooden chapel or beside a sick man's bunk, without anyone recalling having seen him cross the compound. He carried a satchel of warm books from which he read in a soft Latin murmur that few understood, yet which left many oddly comforted or unsettled long after he had gone. He also tended to the foreign labourers employed about the camp, and was granted quiet access to areas within and beyond the wire, a privilege no one seemed inclined to question. On one visit to the camp kitchen compound, Dax paused in the doorway just as Standartenführer Schultzer was whipping a young Polish kitchen girl for having dropped a knife. The sight struck the old pastor like a blow. He did not cry out, nor move to intervene, but stood very still, his gloved hand tightening upon the head of his stick. The girl's thin voice rose in desperate pleas, cut short by each stroke. Several prisoners later swore that, at the moment Dax appeared, the air in the kitchen seemed to still, and the whip fell with a strange sluggishness, as though the very space between the two had thickened. Schultzer himself hesitated, casting a sharp glance toward the doorway, his arm faltering for the briefest instant, as though some unseen presence had laid a hand upon it. If the pastor noticed, he gave no sign. His lips moved soundlessly, and those nearest thought they heard a faint murmur in a language they did not recognize, and carried on no breath. The moment passed. Schultz's rage returned, and the blows resumed with renewed brutality. The girl crumpled at his feet, her cries fading to a weak moan, and at last falling silent. Dax turned away, leaning heavily on his stick, and departed without a word. As he left, one of the guard dogs chained nearby began to whine and shrink back, its ears flat, staring not at Schultzer, but at the pastor's retreating figure. No one remarked upon it at the time. At dawn the next morning, Standartenführer Schultzer was nowhere to be found at roll call. As the prisoners stood in ranks in the freezing cold for the twice-daily head count, his deputy, an Obersturmbannführer named Jankel, went to rouse him, but found only Schultz's uniform hung with fastidious neatness, his boots polished, and his room undisturbed. Every door and window was secured from within. No guard had seen him depart. Jankel, already strained by the winter, assumed control. He ordered the camp turned inside out, within and beyond the wire. This took some time, but not a trace of the man remained. A tremor of fear ran through the ranks of the SS, who recalled the 10 missing Allied prisoners. Jankel realized that whoever was responsible could not have been a prisoner, and fear soon spread among the SS troops and their auxiliaries. Not wishing to admit this, Jankel informed the Allied officers that Schultzer had been recalled to Berlin, a phrase offered with such stiffness that it convinced no one. Cummings, who had cultivated a trading contact among some SS men, later confided that the guards believed something far stranger had occurred. Despite his hardened Nazi beliefs, Jankel could not shake off his childhood memories from his native Bavaria, where people spoke of beings called die Unterirdischen, the underground ones, who were blamed for people vanishing into hills, caves, or hollow mounds and never seen again. Some said they were fairies or little people with power over the living. He had always dismissed such tales as peasant nightmares, but now he harboured serious doubts, and so for the first time in many years he turned to the church in the form of Pastor Dax, who was ordered at the camp gate to report to the commandant's office. Upon entering, Dax felt a sense of palpable evil. The walls were adorned with Nazi regalia, and a large framed photograph of Hitler stood above the fireplace, with a look of contemptuous malice in his eyes. To Dax, the room felt more like a shrine to Satan, and despite the fire burning brightly, the air seemed cold and stiff. Jankel, on seeing the pastor, had lost his former arrogance and nervously beckoned him to sit, offering a strained smile. "Pastor," he said humbly, "I was raised as a Catholic, and I turn to you as a man of God. Do you believe these disappearances are the work of some hitherto unknown power? I know in this age such belief seems frivolous, even ridiculous, but what can explain the disappearance of Standartenführer Schultzer and these 10 prisoners?" His voice trembled, and sweat gathered on his brow as he wiped at it with a handkerchief before taking a large swallow of whiskey. Dax, trying not to smile, replied, "My son, I am but a simple country pastor. I have no knowledge of such things except for the divine power of light and love, which is God." Jankel's voice rose in agitation. He reached across the desk and gripped Dax's hand with sweaty palms. "Pastor, I am a good Christian. I serve the fatherland. I am not a bad man, yet I fear Satan's cloven hoof is afoot in this camp, and he is taking people and their souls to hell." His eyes darted about the room like those of frightened prey. He rose, then sank to his knees beside Dax, pleading, "Pastor, please protect me with prayer. Place me in the safety of our Lord." He began to sob hysterically, gripping the pastor's hands like a child. "My son," said Pastor Dax, "the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh. I will pray for you and your sins, and may the Lord judge you fairly." Dax then left, promising to return to minister to both Jankel and the prisoners. Over the following weeks the prisoners were treated less harshly, though food remained scarce. More timber for fuel was made available, Allied leaders sighed in relief at the absence of further disappearances, and a contact in the fledgling German resistance confirmed that no escapees had reached Allied hands. Neither the Germans nor the prisoners had any explanation for the vanishings, and in a way, Schultz's disappearance had saved them from his threatened reprisals. In late December 1944, as German forces were driven steadily back by the Russians in the east and the Western Allies in the west, concern grew among the prisoners that the SS might decide to dispose of them rather than allow their liberation. Whispers circulated of massacres at other camps. The atmosphere, already tense, became brittle with fear. During a service, Pastor Dax assured Minns that despite the advance of the Red Army, they would remain safe and should not worry. When pressed, he could offer no details, merely saying that the Lord worked in mysterious ways. Minns, not a churchgoer himself, nevertheless felt reassured by the pastor's calm demeanour and passed the message to the other leaders, which eased the strained mood. Then, in January 1945, orders arrived for the camp to be evacuated ahead of the Russian advance. A forced march for the prisoners was scheduled for dawn the following day. Jankel informed the pastor that he would be safer evacuating westward at once for fear of Russian reprisals. Pastor Dax assured him that there was no danger to his own safety and visited the camp one last time before the evacuation, carrying his satchel of religious books and texts. The guards, brusque and anxious as they packed to abandon the camp, initially refused him entry. After confirming with Jankel's office, they allowed him to go inside the chapel, accompanied only as far as the door by a guard who waited outside with a cigarette. Dax promised he would not be long. 10 minutes later he emerged, and carrying his satchel, he returned to the gate and departed without further formality in his pony and trap. That evening the guards ordered lights out in the huts. The prisoners retired to their beds unnervingly calm. Even the guard tower lights seemed still, and those who ventured out to reconnoitre reported little, if any, guard activity. It was assumed that some of the guards had already fled in fear of the Russians, with the remainder to follow in the morning. The following day there was no 6:30 a.m. roll call announced over the loudspeaker, yet the prisoners by habit rose and assembled in the bitter cold. Minns and Cummings went to investigate. There were no guards, no sentries, no shouted orders, no figures pacing the watchtowers. The entire SS garrison had vanished as completely as Schultzer and the 10 missing prisoners. Minns and Cummings crossed the deserted checkpoints to the commandant's office. Outside stood a familiar pony and trap. Inside, seated quietly at the commandant's desk, was Pastor Dax. He closed a small Latin book as they entered and inclined his head with a faint smile. "You need not fear further molestation," he said in mild cultured English. "The guards will not return." "You mean they fled?" Cummings asked. "They have been summoned elsewhere," Dax replied. "Their deeds had reached a point beyond forgiveness. I merely ensured that they would trouble God's earth no longer." Minns swallowed. "What do you mean? That is to say, how was it done?" The old pastor rested a hand upon the book. "Through prayer and ancient manuscripts," he said gently, "and with words older than man. That is all." An American officer entered, reporting that the camp was deserted, the stores untouched, and the gates open. The Russians were estimated to be 3 days distant. Cummings, suspecting that Dax knew far more than he had said, asked the question that had haunted him. "Pastor, the 10 prisoners who vanished earlier, was that your doing?" Dax nodded once. "They were not allies. They were German agents planted among you. They too had to be removed." Then, with visible effort, he rose. "I must now return to where I came. My duty here is done. The Germans will not return." They watched as he mounted the trap and drove away into the pale winter light, his figure diminishing down the icy road until it was lost from sight. 3 days later, the Russians liberated the camp. In the SS barracks, soldiers' uniforms and boots were neatly placed in their lockers, and beds appeared disordered as though they had been slept in. In the mess hall lay plates of half-eaten food, with full and half-empty mugs beside them. The guard posts held abandoned weapons, but as everywhere else, there was no trace of their owners. The Russians were as confounded as the former prisoners. It appeared as though the garrison had simply vanished in an instant, leaving uniform and weapon behind. There was no trace anywhere of Commandant Yankel. The Russians concluded that the SS had fled in civilian clothing, yet personal possessions and garments remained. None of this made sense. Minns and Cummings chose not to share what they knew of Pastor Dax, fearing ridicule, and the prisoners were returned safely to their respective forces and countries. In 1946, Cummings learned that Yankel had been located. The sole Nazi survivor from the camp had been found in Hamburg, clinically insane and unfit to stand trial. He remained in institutions until his death in 1972. But what of Pastor Dax? It was not until 1965, while serving as an attaché at the American Embassy in Berlin, that Cummings received permission from the East German authorities to visit Obergen, Dax's home village, during celebrations marking 20 years of communist rule. Though accompanied by officials, he was allowed to inquire after the pastor, who, if still alive, would have been in his 90s. Cummings did not expect to find him living, but he sought closure and wished to thank the man who, through God's will or some other mercurial process, had saved their lives. The mayor, Herr Gustav Schmidt, escorted him to the small churchyard on the village's edge, where an ancient oak spread its bare branches over weathered stones. He spoke with quiet reverence of Pastor Wilhelm Dax, a man of unyielding moral courage who had denounced Nazi cruelty from his pulpit. For this he had been seized by the Gestapo and shot in 1943. They walked on in silence until Schmidt halted before a solitary grave beneath the oak. The stone was simple, the lettering neat. Wilhelm Dax, Pastor, 1871 to 1943, sei getreu bis in den Tod. Cummings stared at the dates for several minutes, his breath misting in the cold air. "He died a year before we met him," he said at last, his voice unsteady. "This is impossible." Schmidt nodded solemnly. "I was here," he replied. "The whole village was. We buried him ourselves." He paused, then added in a lower voice, almost to himself, "The earth was very heavy that day." Cummings looked sharply at him, but the mayor merely folded his hands behind his back and gazed toward the church tower, offering nothing further. No explanation presented itself. The fact stood stark and immovable, yet Cummings knew that during that bitter winter, when cruelty had seemed ascendant and hope all but extinguished, something had intervened. Something beyond flesh or earthly authority, answering only to God. He never spoke of Pastor Dax again. The end.